we should start really with the kind of king of these fake right populists, and that's Tucker Carlson. So there is this really good article by friend of the show, Alan McLeod, over at Mint Press. And I know that you helped send some research to him for this article on Tucker Carlson. It's titled "The Elite Pedigree of a Brilliant Cosplaying Populist." And I'll let you kind of summarize some of the main points. But in this article, he points out how, Tucker comes from this extremely rich family. He used to boast about how he was a completely out of touch elite. And now all he does is criticize the elites, but he never defines what an elite actually is. He's certainly not against capitalists because he's very pro-capitalist. So he uses elite in this very ambiguous way that makes it easy to be a so-called populist because, again, all this is left undefined and politically vague. Meanwhile, I mean, you found, and Alan McLeod showed in this article, that Tucker Carlson tried to join the CIA. And I mean, his dad also is very shady, which you can talk about, working for CIA media outlets, U.S. regime media outlets, spreading propaganda. So Tucker Carlson is CIA adjacent. And Tucker Carlson was in Nicaragua, where I am right now, in the 1980s, supporting the Contra death squads, and was apparently working with the CIA-backed right wing in Nicaragua because there are photos of him with Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, who became the U.S.-backed right-wing puppet leader after the Sandinistas were pushed out of power by the U.S. through this terrorist war. So, I mean, not even to mention, which we'll talk about in a bit, we'll show some clips of Tucker's insane pro-war propaganda against China and Iran and Venezuela. But even aside from that, I mean, Tucker Carlson has an extremely shady history. So talk about his links to the CIA, his father's extremely shady work, and what he was doing in Nicaragua in the 80s.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I recently found this interview he gave where he's just sort of being asked random questions. I think it's just like sort of like a lightning round of questions some talk show host was asking him. And one of the questions was like, what did he do when he was in college, or what's something like exciting or strange he did in college? And he says that he ended up going down to Nicaragua to help the Contras in their war. He doesn't specifically mention the CIA in this little interchange, but people like you and me and other people who've studied U.S. imperialism understand that was a major CIA war in Nicaragua, where the CIA and lots of disinformation and lots of forces were used to try to discredit the Sandinistas, propagandize against them. And what's fascinating is it's almost like, so he tried to join the CIA and apparently didn't get in, according to him. Meanwhile, his father starts work at the U.S. Information Agency under Reagan. He was handpicked actually by Reagan. He made friends with someone who was close to Ronald Reagan. Dick Carlson did, Tucker Carlson's father. And he got hired to be the head of the Voice of America, which is the radio arm of sort of U.S. disinformation. It's a U.S. state-funded media outlet that's closely been linked to the CIA since its existence. He's also partly responsible, even though he claims he's not. The timing of when he got there is simultaneously when Radio Marti started, which was another U.S. state-funded media outlet that was broadcast only in Cuba, designed to, sort of undermine the Cuban government, essentially, which is the purpose of all U.S. state-funded media, essentially. And he was also instrumental in collaborating with a radio station called Radio Beijing. Now, this apparently was not officially part of VOA, but they somehow collaborated with them during the Tiananmen Square incident as well. So oddly, Dick Carlson, Tucker Carlson's son, played this really big role in opening up dad. Cuba.
Tucker Carlson's
sorry to say his son. Sorry. Played this really big role in opening up Cuba and China to a lot of U.S. propaganda via their airwaves in their own native languages. So like in Cuba in Spanish, and I don't know what it was, if they did it in Mandarin in China, but it basically was designed to undermine both of those governments. And Dick Carlson has this extremely interesting, detailed interview he did with a student at some college, where he goes through every experience he had at VOA and what he did. One question that the guy asked him is, he says, would you, from a practical point of view, if you are from the other side, is a Voice of America correspondent far more dangerous than a spy? And Dick Carlson says, oh, yes, it is far more dangerous. So he's sort of bragging throughout this interview of like how much of a role they had to play in like sort of this spycraft like activity of undermining these other governments, throughout the world. And he was also instrumental in, some of the broadcasts in Soviet territory and in the Soviet Union as the Berlin Wall is falling. So his role there, he was part of all these really big events that were considered, these big wins for the U.S. government. And meanwhile, around the same time, his son is doing what appears to be almost like a Mormon-style mission, like a CIA Mormon-style mission to Nicaragua to help the Contras fight in this war that was also being, propped up by Reagan's CIA. So very, very strange history there. And also Tucker describes him going down with some of his college buddies. One of those buddies is someone who people may be familiar with, Neil Patel, who ended up being a top advisor to Dick Cheney and a very instrumental player in the Bush administration. And this is also something interesting. You have this idea that Tucker Carlson is some kind of populist. Well, the Swanson dinner, his father marrying the heir of the Swanson, Swanson dinner fortune, kind of takes that label away from him to some extent. But I think this idea that he made his way through media by like climbing up, writing for papers or whatever, however he wants to present himself, is also false, because his father nepotistically got him his first media job because his father was also involved in running PBS. And Tucker's first media job was not like being like a mailroom clerk at PBS. It was literally like being given his own show at PBS. So his daddy got him his own show under his own name, like as his first media gig, incidentally enough. So that was before Tucker Carlson started working for Bill Kristol at the Weekly Standard, which we can talk about later if you want.
Yeah, I mean, this is a key point. We need to understand that, Tucker has been trying to rebrand as like the right-wing populist who's against the neocons. He was a neocon for the vast majority of his career. He got his start at the Weekly Standard, but I'll get to that in a second. I mean, just for people who are skeptical, this is an article back in 2017 before Tucker became like a massively huge name with the biggest show in the U.S. over at The Week, and it's citing this report in the New Yorker. And it's Tucker Carlson tried to join the CIA. And here's the quote from this profile in the New Yorker magazine. After college, Carlson tried and failed to persuade the CIA to employ him. I mean, again, that's what he says. How much can you believe someone who admitted to trying to join the CIA? But let's talk about what Tucker did after, supporting the Contras in Nicaragua and trying to join the CIA. He also started working for neocon media outlets, including the Neocon Bible, the Weekly Standard, and he was actually a Democrat until 2020. He was registered as a Democrat, and it shows again how these neocons, they have this, they go constantly in between the two parties, right? Because when it comes to imperialism, Democrats and Republicans are indistinguishable. They both support U.S. empire and war. So it's not surprising to see that Tucker was a Democrat and then now he's a Republican, because, he was a neocon. Talk about what he was doing for years leading up to now.
I mean, one of the most interesting things I found about him, and this is completely randomly, because I buy, if I find a good collection of old Weekly Standards issues, I'll buy them on like eBay, because a lot of those reprintings or the digital copies don't exist. So some of that stuff is kind of like lost in time forever. So I just brought a stack randomly from the 90s on eBay. It was like $20 for like 20 issues or something. And I was like kind of surprised, because I just had no idea that like half of the issues had Tucker Carlson's name in the credits. And I was like, oh, this is really crazy. I just had no idea, you know, the way he presents himself now that he even wrote for the Weekly Standard. And all, you know, I was already familiar with his book Ship of Fools, which depicts Bill Kristol in cartoon caricature form on the cover. Like, look at this, you know, fucking idiot. He's, you know, a total warmonger. It's kind of like the way Tucker is presenting him in this book. Although Tucker admittedly does say in the book that he still thinks Bill Kristol is like charming and funny, and he contrasts him with Robert Kagan, saying Robert Kagan was like an arrogant a-hole and someone that he did not like at all. But when Tucker Carlson wrote for the Weekly Standard, most of his stuff was pretty boilerplate. You know, it's funny you mentioned that he was a Democrat, because it's largely just like social conservative boilerplate kind of crap in the Weekly Standard. A lot of people forget that the neocon Bible, as they call it, the Weekly Standard, had a lot of stuff in it also that resembles the kind of right populist, you know, America First stuff people, you know, say is populist today. It was mixed together.
And Robbie, that whole America First branding, that goes back to Ronald Reagan.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. So Tucker Carlson, I'd say probably the most interesting editorial or article that I just happened to come across in the stack of Weekly Standards I had was an article, a very long article, bashing journalist, San Jose Mercury writer, journalist Gary Webb for his expose on the CIA having a role in the crack epidemic and being involved in drug trafficking. And
in order to fund the Contra death squads that Tucker Carlson supported.
Exactly. And it gets even weirder too, right? Because I was like, well, wait a second. I remember seeing Elliot Abrams' name on one of these Weekly Standards in this same archive I bought. So I was looking through a bunch of them, and I started to find, you know, in consecutive months, bylines from Tucker and Elliot Abrams on like the same Weekly Standard issues. And I'm like, so this is the guy who literally was taking money from Oliver North's slush fund, who was implicated in the Iran-Contra scandal in the Reagan administration. Elliot Abrams, for people who don't know, also a project for the New American Century, neocon, wrote articles side by side with Tucker Carlson in the Weekly Standard. Meanwhile, Tucker Carlson is writing articles saying, oh, there's nothing to see here. This is all scaremongering from this crazy, you know, crackpot journalist, Gary Webb. So it's multiple layers of ridiculousness when you think about it. It's, you know, there's one of the guys who was part of Iran-Contra writing for the same magazine Tucker is, while he's, you know, bashing Webb. And it's fascinating because there's this whole idea now that sort of these right populists are somehow aligned in opposition to the CIA. You know, like the deep state is liberal, right? According to these people. So therefore, they're sort of they're in opposition to the CIA. Now, it's interesting to me because this theme actually does go back to even like very, very neocon administrations. You can make the argument, if you wanted to, that the Bush administration was against the CIA for trying to wage some kind of like, you know, war against a part of the CIA by uncovering Valerie Plame's name and her husband, going against Joe Wilson, them basically trying to browbeat aspects of the CIA into giving them the intelligence that they wanted to, and then punishing them when they didn't. I mean, so this whole idea, I think, has just become so oversimplified, and deliberately so, to make it appear that these people are somehow like in opposition to the deep state of the CIA, when it's just clear that it's, I mean, at the very least, it's not that simple. And we have ample evidence that Tucker is like right in the pocket of this alignment that was completely aligned with some of the most hardcore hawkish CIA forces that there ever were, like in our lifetime. So it's kind of peculiar that now he's acting like he is, you know, completely on the opposite of this, you know, today.
Yeah, I mean, and this narrative goes back to Nixon, who, I mean, in some ways was kind of a victim of the deep state. There was, you know, Watergate is a whole other thing to get into, and the role of the CIA in that, and, you know, the CIA's chosen journalist that it works with at the Washington Post and all that. But I mean, you know, you could go back to Richard Nixon, who was, of course, a hardcore right-wing conservative, vehement anti-communist, who also, you know, would criticize the CIA after, I mean, organizing the coup in Chile. And, you know, Richard Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, saying, make the economy scream in Chile and all that. But anyway, I mean, I want to get to what Tucker still does today. Because look, one of the talking points used by people is they say, fine, Tucker has a history for the vast majority of his career of being a neocon, supporting the Iraq War. He referred to Iraqis as semi-literate primitive monkeys. I mean, so we haven't even talked about Tucker Carlson being a full-on white supremacist. I mean, he's a straight-up explicit racist. And of course, I mean, how anyone can look past that and justify that for me is just fucking mind-blowing. I mean, this guy is a complete white supremacist. But even aside from that, I mean, I want to focus on what he's still doing today, because his critics, or his supporters rather, will say, well, you know, Tucker Carlson was bad, you know, 10 years ago, but he's turned a new leaf. He's no longer a neocon. Now he's supposedly anti-war. I want to show some of these clips of the insane propaganda on his show. And you have like a really good thread with some of these video clips showing how he's just he's been pushing a bunch of full-on neocon propaganda against Venezuela, Iran, and especially China. But I'm going to start with this clip here, which is from 2018. And this is an insane neocon clip about Venezuela that you found. And again, this is Tucker Carlson in 2018. This is not back when, you know, he supported the Iraq War and was a full-on neocon. And now this is when he claims to be a right-wing populist. Here's this clip you have.
We have war criminals in our own hemisphere. China is taking over Latin America and the Caribbean. Venezuela has...
Oh my God. I mean, there's so many things to say about this clip, but just he starts saying, we have war criminals in our own hemisphere. Of course, he's not referring to the U.S. government officials who are war criminals. He's referring to Latin America. And then he says China is taking over our hemisphere, referring to Latin America as the U.S. colonial property. So, I mean, that rhetoric alone is just, it shows like this idea of a right-wing populist. It's such bullshit. But let me continue here.
We have war criminals in our own hemisphere. China is taking over Latin America and the Caribbean. Venezuela has collapsed. El Salvador is collapsing. Mexico has a drug war that's killed more people than we lost in Vietnam. The world in our hemisphere, our neighbors, contiguous countries are collapsing, and we're ignoring that for the sake of some weird war in Syria 6,000 miles from here. Does this seem a little off to you?
Well, as I said to you before, because we can't deal with every incidents of war criminalization.
So the guy speaking is a former Hillary Clinton advisor. And what Tucker always does is he always has this false debate with some, you know, neoliberal pro-war Democrat. He won't debate it with, you know, a leftist who supports Venezuela or China or whatever. I mean, it's ridiculous. And yeah, he'll sometimes have a few token leftists on, but he'll frame it in a way that always helps the Republican Party and that helped Donald Trump when Trump was in power. But let me continue here.
Incidents of war criminalization doesn't mean we have to back away.
But why this? Why would we deal with Maduro in Venezuela first? Well, people, I mean, Maduro destroyed a first world country, almost first world country. I mean, Maduro destroyed a first world country, almost first.
So then he says, why don't we deal with Maduro first? That is, why doesn't the U.S. overthrow the Venezuelan government because he supposedly destroyed his country? Full-on neocon rhetoric, and he's doing it in a way where he's like, I'm against the war in Syria, but that's because I want the war to come home. This is not anti-war. Like, and there's so many of these clips. Here's another one. I mean, this is an incredible clip you found, Robbie. This is another 2018 clip of Tucker Carlson saying that in Venezuela, they eat zoo animals. Insane neocon propaganda.
Well, no country in the Western Hemisphere has failed more completely in more ways than Venezuela, sadly. Has a lot going for it. Had a huge...
I mean, first of all, that's insane. He mentioned, you know, that El Salvador had a failed state. I mean, El Salvador had the highest murder rate on earth. El Salvador has been largely responsible for a huge immigration flow because of, you know, not to mention the U.S. history of supporting the Civil War in El Salvador, or Honduras, where the U.S.-backed coup regime also led the country to having the highest murder rate on earth. But he says Venezuela is the worst. I mean, again, neocon propaganda.
Well, no country in the Western Hemisphere has failed more completely in more ways than Venezuela, sadly. Has a lot going for it. Had a huge middle class. It has, of course, the world's largest proven oil reserves. Today, it can't even feed itself. There's no toilet paper some days in Caracas. They're eating zoo animals.
There's no toilet paper. They're eating zoo animals. I can assure everyone watching and listening, I've been to Venezuela numerous times. There is food, there is toilet paper. They're not eating zoo animals.
Has, of course, the world's largest proven oil reserves. Today, it can't even feed itself. There's no toilet paper some days in Caracas. They're eating zoo animals. What happened? Well, you know what happened. They implemented socialism, and there were obvious and predictable and disastrous consequences. But
he said, what happened? Socialism. No mention of the sanctions, no mention of the U.S. hybrid war, because he supports that war on Venezuela.
That's not the whole story of what happened there. 6 years ago, the government of Venezuela passed a gun ban specifically designed to disarm the public. It, of course, did not make people safer. Venezuela has one of the highest murder rates in the world. That wasn't the point of it. The point was to make the people powerless, and it definitely did that. As one terrified Venezuelan put it, quote, people never would have believed they needed to defend themselves against the government. But of course, they did. In the past 2 years, almost 200 protesters, pro-democracy protesters, have been murdered by the security forces of dictator Nicolas Maduro.
Straight up fake statistic from one of these U.S. government-backed fake NGOs. And he also calls Maduro a dictator. Again, neocon rhetoric, straight up. This is a so-called right-wing populist.
In the past 2 years, almost 200 protesters, pro-democracy protesters, have been murdered by the security forces of dictator Nicolas Maduro. The government still has guns, of course. Authoritarians aren't stupid. They never give up their guns. That's rule one. So it applies just as well to the United States as it does to failing socialist states. In New Jersey, ordinary citizens can go to prison for possessing gun magazines that hold too many rounds. Bernie Kerik is a former NYPD commissioner.
Yeah, so then he brings on an NYPD commissioner and talk about who this guy is.
Oh, yeah. Bernard Kerik is one of the craziest. It's probably one of the strangest appointments in the Bush administration. He was the NYPD commissioner, very close to Giuliani, kind of his bag man. He seems like a straight up mobster. He went to jail for taking bribes. He wrote like a book about how he left behind his Vietnamese daughter in Vietnam because he didn't realize he had like a child with somebody there. His story is very strange, but anyways, the strangest thing about him is that he immediately gets plucked by Rumsfeld to exclusively go to Iraq and essentially be the vice governor of Iraq under Paul Bremer, in charge of training the Iraqi police in Iraq. And there's also a strange connection between him and one of these kind of right populist think tanks, the Manhattan Institute, which largely sponsored all these Disney leaks coming out by Chris Rufo. They actually were hired to work with Bernard Kerik to train the NYPD on anti-terrorism tactics in the early Bush administration. So the Manhattan Institute worked with Bernard Kerik. It's a whole bunch of weird stuff there, but basically, yeah, he's a crazy neocon guy who's linked with Rudy Giuliani and worked under Paul Bremer in Iraq.
Yeah, so these are the neocons that so-called right-wing populist Tucker Carlson brings on his show. I mean, you have so many clips of these. I'm going to play another clip here, and then I'll have you comment on it about Elliot Abrams. You mentioned, Tucker had been writing alongside Elliot Abrams back in the Weekly Standard. Of course, Elliot Abrams is this notorious war criminal who used so-called humanitarian aid convoys of flights of the CIA cutout USAID to send weapons to the Contras in Nicaragua. I mean, of course, he was at the center of Iran-Contra. So here's Tucker Carlson attacking Ilhan Omar for criticizing war criminal Elliot Abrams. And you point out that Tucker Carlson brought up Stacey Abrams 7 times more than neocon Elliot Abrams, since Elliot Abrams was appointed to the State Department under Donald Trump, of course. And what was Elliot Abrams doing under Trump? Overseeing the Venezuela coup attempt, just as he had overseen the terrorist war on Nicaragua. So here's a clip from 2019 from Tucker Carlson.
Congresswoman Omar is starting a lot of fights recently. For a newcomer, she's in the center of many news stories. Today on Capitol Hill, she berated the new envoy to Venezuela, Elliot Abrams, accusing him of being a liar and attacking him over the Iran-Contra affair that took place more than 30 years ago. Here's part of it.
Do you think that massacre was a fabulous achievement that happened under our watch?
That is a ridiculous question, and
yes or no?
No.
I will take that as a yes.
Congresswoman Omar is herself, of course, a refugee to this country. She was born in Mogadishu. She spent most of her time, at least her political life, attacking this country as immoral. Congressman.
So he's criticizing that she's attacking the U.S. government over its war crimes. And I mean, there's so many of these. Here's another one.
Really quick, we're almost out of time. Elliot Abrams, who served in the last Bush administration, is under consideration to become Deputy Secretary of State. You wrote this: crack the door to admit Elliot Abrams and the neocons will become scurrying in by the hundreds.
Yeah, I think someone who was a never Trumper, someone who never be in a Trump State Department. I mean, for goodness sakes. But he also represents things that Donald Trump doesn't. President Trump has been different than many. He said that nation building hasn't worked. When he said that, Elliot Abrams came forward and said, he's absolutely wrong. Nation building is what we need to do. Regime change, Iraq war. Elliot Abrams was one of the key architects of the Iraq war. We don't need people with the failed policies back in. Trump does represent something new and different foreign policy, and I think a welcome relief from the neocons. So I hope he doesn't appoint somebody who doesn't really agree with him.
I'm baffled by it. I got to be honest. Senator Paul, thanks a lot.
So he was baffled by it, but then here his on his same show, here is promoting Elliot Abrams again.
Diplomatic relations between the United States and Venezuela are continuing to deteriorate tonight. The U.S. no longer recognizes Nicolas Maduro as president of that country. In response to that, Venezuela has ordered American diplomats to leave Venezuela. The U.S. has not complied. The Trump administration now says, quote, all options are on the table regarding Venezuela. Could this lead to a military conflict of some kind with that country? Fox News chief intelligence correspondent Catherine Herridge has been following the situation in Venezuela very closely, and she joins us tonight with a report.
Thank you, Tucker, and good evening. Venezuela is much more than a regional conflict, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo confirming that Iran has a significant footprint in Venezuela and other Latin American nations.
So full-on anti-Iran neocon propaganda saying Venezuela is a threat because Iran. I mean, right on Tucker Carlson's show. Listen to this insane shit.
Iran has a significant footprint in Venezuela and other Latin American nations through the terrorist group Hezbollah. The FBI is seeking information about an operative, Ghazi Nasser al-Din, who is tied to Hezbollah and has Syrian and Venezuelan passports. Based on recent intelligence, Nasser al-Din was operating from Venezuela. Sanctioned by the Treasury Department, he has at least 10 aliases, and he's linked to clandestine networks in Syria that amplified the violence and fueled the Syrian refugee crisis, eventually drawing in the U.S., Russia, and Iran.
Wow. She says that Hezbollah is what is responsible for the refugee crisis in Syria, and it drew in the U.S., not mentioning, you know, the U.S. weapons that went to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the U.S. so-called moderate rebels who were allied with Al-Qaeda. But this is this insane neocon propaganda on Tucker Carlson's show. Let me continue here.
And he's linked to clandestine networks in Syria that amplified the violence and fueled the Syrian refugee crisis, eventually drawing in the U.S., Russia, and Iran. National security experts said a similar scenario may be playing out in Venezuela. Latest projections from the Brookings Institution, a Washington, D.C. think tank, are 8.2 million refugees and migrants may leave Venezuela. That is 25% of the current population. And now Russia, China, and Cuba are backing the Maduro regime.
Russia, China, and Cuba are backing the Maduro regime. This is Tucker Carlson's show.
Population. And now Russia, China, and Cuba are backing the Maduro regime. In his most recent interview, President Trump left the military option open, but significantly made no commitments, Tucker.
Catherine Herridge, a story we will continue to follow. Thank you very much for that.
So, I mean, that is straight up classical neocon propaganda. I mean, just comment on that, Robbie.
I mean, it goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning, that it does seem like really the only fundamental difference between some of these hawks is that they have different timelines for which countries they want to go after. It's like he's saying, like, why are we worried about Syria and when we should be worrying about Venezuela? It's like in our hemisphere. So like a lot, I've noticed over the years, especially since Trump, there has been this attempt made, because a lot of sort of neocons like Max Boot, Bill Kristol, Robert Kagan have presented themselves as more liberal. Like, for example, Bill Kristol is now pro Roe versus Wade and gay marriage, even though he like wrote against both very vociferously back when he was writing for the Weekly Standard. So there's this perception now, and I run into this all the time, where people think the neocons are all liberals. They're all Democrats now. All the neocons are Democrats. There are no neocons in the Republican Party, people will say. And that's because I think they're using a very narrow definition of what a neocon is. It's more of this sort of liberal interventionist mindset that comes from, sort of the Irving Kristol, the Trotskyite lineage. And so a lot of these people will even go as far as saying, like, actually the neocons are really just all communist. They're commies. You even see some like libertarians saying that. Well, what that does is it omits like an entire other side of, let's just focus on Project for the New American Century, the most infamous neocon think tank that had 17 of its signatories and members go into the Bush administration and become very influential policymakers within the Bush administration. If you want to call those people neocons, let's just start there. Well, I'd say about 30% of them have drifted into this world of what could be called the populist right now. That includes people like Michael Ledeen, like James Woolsey, like William Bennett, like Frank Gaffney.